Daniel Harrow had always believed that peace could be bought, not through lavish vacations or endless luxuries, but through a quiet corner of the world that belonged solely to him. For years, he had saved and worked tirelessly until the day came when he could finally sign the papers on his dream property, a modest but charming home with a private lake shimmering at its back. The water stretched wide enough to reflect the sky like a polished mirror, framed by tall oaks and whispering reeds that swayed gently with the breeze. To Daniel, it wasn't just property, it was sanctuary. His neighbors often admired the lake from afar, commenting on its beauty whenever they passed. Still, Daniel was protective of it. While most residents in the community belonged to the homeowners association, Daniel had fought successfully to keep his lake off the official shared use list. It was his, written into the deed with no ambiguity. For him, this little patch of water was a retreat from the chatter of neighborhood rules, lawn inspections, and endless discussions about paint colors. Daniel was not unfriendly, but he preferred his solitude. He had built a small wooden dock for fishing, installed a bench where he liked to read on summer evenings, and often found himself watching fireflies blink across the water long after the sun had disappeared. If there was one place where time felt suspended, it was here at the lake. Then came the accident. It happened on a day that began like any other. Daniel was on his way into town, a short drive through winding roads that curved around the edges of the community. A sudden flash of headlights, a skid of tires, and a collision that left him unconscious marked the end of his normal routine. He never saw the ambulance lights, never heard the worried voices. All he knew next was darkness, followed by a silence deeper than the lake itself. As Daniel lay in a coma at the hospital, life in the neighborhood carried on. Yet his absence did not go unnoticed by the Homeowners Association, particularly by its president, Blaine. Was a woman of vision, or so she often reminded others. She had an eye for turning unused spaces into community treasures, and she thrived on projects that gave her recognition. To her, Daniel's secluded lake, now left without its watchful owner, looked less like private property and more like wasted potential. The first mention of the lake appeared innocently enough during an HOA board meeting. "It seems a shame," said, adjusting her glasses as she studied the agenda, "that such a beautiful body of water sits unused. With Daniel unwell and no one maintaining it, perhaps we should consider making it available for neighborhood enjoyment. Just temporarily, of course." Some board members hesitated, aware that Daniel's deed gave him full rights, but had a way of weaving her arguments. She spoke of unity, of children needing a safe place to gather, of how the community could benefit from shared outdoor space. She pointed out that other neighborhoods had lakes with gazebos and picnic areas that drew families together. By the end of the meeting, her suggestion had grown into a motion, and though a few quiet voices of doubt remained, the majority agreed. The lake was reclassified as a community feature. Within weeks, changes began. It started with a single structure, a white-painted gazebo built at the water's edge. The HOA newsletter announced it proudly, calling it a new spot for neighborly gatherings. Soon after came the flyers advertising a weekend barbecue by the lake. Residents arrived with folding chairs, coolers, and laughter that carried across the once quiet waters. For many, it felt like an exciting new chapter for the community. For the lake itself, it was the beginning of transformation. Had Daniel been awake, he might have stood firmly against it. But in his silence, the Homeowners Association filled the void with its own ideas, reshaping his sanctuary into something entirely different. What had once been a hidden retreat was now becoming the heart of neighborhood activity. And though the community seemed thrilled, not everyone could ignore the uneasy feeling that lines had been crossed. The gazebo was only the beginning. At first, it looked harmless enough: white beams, a sloping roof, and a set of benches beneath it. Neighbors admired the way it caught the evening light, and some even brought their morning coffee to sit and chat there. What had been Daniel's quiet shoreline now had the gentle hum of voices and laughter drifting across the water. It was pleasant in a way, but it carried a sense of change. The Homeowners Association wasted no time in celebrating its accomplishment. Blaine, pleased with how smoothly her idea had been accepted, decided the gazebo deserved a proper unveiling. She organized what she called Lake Harrow's first community barbecue. Flyers were slipped into every mailbox, decorated with bright designs and cheerful fonts. The headline read, "A place for all of us, come celebrate our new gathering spot." On the day of the event, the once still lake was surrounded by activity. Families carried baskets of food, children ran with beach balls, and neighbors who hadn't spoken in months reconnected over grilled burgers and picnic blankets. Music played softly from a portable speaker, and the air filled with the scent of sizzling hot dogs. People were delighted. The gazebo became a backdrop for photos, the dock turned into a makeshift fishing competition spot, and the lake reflected both the setting sun and the laughter of dozens of voices. Walked among the crowd with a smile of triumph, shaking hands, offering compliments, and making sure everyone associated the success with her leadership. Still, not everyone was entirely at ease. George Miller, one of the older residents who had known Daniel for years, stood quietly near the edge of the crowd. He enjoyed seeing the community together, but something about it unsettled him. He remembered Daniel's pride in keeping the lake private, remembered long conversations about how hard he'd fought to keep it out of HOA hands. Now Daniel was nowhere to be found, and his lake was filled with people who treated it as if it had always belonged to them. George voiced his concerns to a few neighbors, but most brushed them aside. "It's temporary," they said. "Daniel would want us to enjoy it. Look at how happy everyone is." The laughter and the glow of the bonfire seemed to quiet any doubts. After the barbecue's success, the HOA grew bolder, called another meeting, pointing to the turnout as proof that they were on the right track. "The lake has been wasted for too long," she said with enthusiasm. "Now it's alive, but a gazebo isn't enough. We should improve the shoreline, make it safer and more welcoming." The idea of improvement sounded reasonable, but in practice it meant more changes. A group of volunteers cleaned the area, clearing reeds and trimming branches. Soon, picnic tables appeared. Benches were added along the path that led to the water. What had once been Daniel's quiet dock now looked like a miniature park, carefully arranged for gatherings. As the weeks passed, word of the lake's transformation spread beyond the neighborhood. Friends and relatives of residents began showing up for weekend visits. Children splashed in the shallow edges while parents lounged in the shade of the gazebo. The lake, once a private refuge, was now a lively destination. For some, it was a dream come true. The neighborhood felt more connected than ever, and there was always something happening by the water. But for others, like George, the changes brought unease. He worried about how far the HOA might go. He noticed small details, like how funds for the picnic tables came from a line in the HOA budget labeled beautification, and how receipts for supplies were signed by herself. Despite the questions forming in his mind, the momentum seemed unstoppable. Residents who once avoided HOA meetings now attended with excitement, eager to discuss new plans for the lake. Ideas flowed: sand for a beach, paddle boats, even a summer festival. Each suggestion was met with cheers. And while Daniel remained silent in his hospital bed, unaware of the transformation, his lake was slipping further from his control. The gazebo had opened the door, and the community had stepped through it eagerly, leaving behind the quiet sanctuary it once was. What began as a single change had now sparked a chain reaction. The lake was no longer simply Daniel's. It had become the community's favorite new attraction and was already planning the next step. The gazebo and picnic tables had been only the beginning. By late spring, the lake had become a gathering point for nearly every household in the community. Weekends buzzed with laughter, cookouts, and small parties, and weekday evenings often saw couples strolling along the water's edge. The once private retreat Daniel had built for himself was now the neighborhood's favorite attraction. At the center of it all stood Blaine, smiling as if she had personally delivered this joy to her neighbors. She thrived on the praise. Every thank you and every compliment about how wonderful the lake looked gave her more determination to push the project further. But in her eyes, something was missing. A gazebo and picnic benches were nice, but they did not yet make the lake a true showpiece. At the next homeowners association meeting, she unveiled her bold idea. "Imagine," she said, leaning forward with her hands clasped, "a sandy beach right here in our own neighborhood. Families wouldn't have to drive across town for a day at the water. Children could build, adults could relax with their feet in the sand. We have the lake, why not make it into a place everyone can enjoy to the fullest?" The room erupted with enthusiasm. The thought of having a beach just a short walk away excited parents and delighted children. One resident even suggested they could host volleyball tournaments. The only person who hesitated was George Miller. He raised his hand slowly. "Isn't the lake private property?" he asked carefully. "Belongs to Daniel Harrow. I'm not sure he ever agreed to this." Smile never faltered. "George," she replied smoothly, "Daniel has been absent for a long time. The community cannot leave valuable land unused. We're simply caring for it in his place. Besides, this is for the good of everyone." Her words, delivered with confidence, seemed to calm the room. George didn't press further, but a small knot of worry settled deeper in his chest. A few weeks later, trucks arrived, unloading piles of golden sand along the shoreline. Volunteers spread it out with rakes and shovels until the once natural bank of reeds and grasses looked like a seaside strip. Children squealed as they kicked off their shoes and ran into the fresh sand. Parents laid out towels and umbrellas, treating it like a day at the coast. The transformation was stunning. The lake no longer looked like a private retreat tucked behind a single home. It had the character of a public beach, lively and inviting. The water rippled with the splashes of children, and the air carried the rhythm of beach balls bouncing and radios playing cheerful tunes. Organized an official beach opening day, complete with games, prizes, and food trucks parked nearby. The event drew not just neighbors but friends from outside the community. Cars lined the streets and laughter echoed well into the evening. For many, it was the highlight of the season. Yet beneath the excitement, quiet murmurs of unease began to grow. Some longtime residents missed the calm that had once defined the lake. They noticed how crowded it had become, how parking spilled into driveways, and how the once pristine water now carried floating soda cans and forgotten toys. Others began to wonder about expenses. Where had the funds for truckloads of sand and food vendors come from? The HOA budget was usually tight, yet suddenly there seemed to be endless resources. George Miller paid attention. He noticed that receipts and invoices weren't being shared openly as they once had been. He also noticed how quickly dismissed questions, brushing them aside with promises of full transparency soon. Despite his concerns, most residents remained enchanted. The beach had created a new sense of energy in the neighborhood. For families, it was a dream. For teenagers, it was freedom. For it was power. She was praised as the leader who turned an ordinary neighborhood into a destination. And while the community cheered, Daniel Harrow still lay silent in his hospital bed, unaware that the sanctuary he had cherished was gone. The dock he had built by hand was now buried under sand. The reeds he had watched sway in the wind were replaced by volleyball nets. The peace he had sought in the lake had been replaced by music, chatter, and the constant churn of activity. What had once been his escape was now everyone else's playground. And though the transformation seemed unstoppable, the unease simmering beneath the surface was only just beginning to grow. By midsummer, the lake had become more than just a neighborhood beach. It had transformed into the crown jewel of the community, and under Blaine's leadership, it was only getting bigger. The sand had been a success, the gazebo was constantly occupied, and families now spoke of lake weekends as if they were official holidays, but was not the sort of person to stop at success. To her, each achievement was a platform for something grander. Her next project was, "If we want to create a true experience," she announced at an HOA meeting, "we need to think atmosphere. People don't just want sand, they want a destination. They want to feel like they're stepping into something special." That weekend, volunteers strung tiki torches around the beach, their flickering flames casting warm light across the water. Strings of fairy lights hung from the gazebo, and the picnic area was decorated with colorful banners. Soon, what had once been Daniel's quiet shoreline glowed each evening with festive charm. The additions changed everything. Nights at the lake grew longer. Families lingered after dinner, teenagers gathered around bonfires, and music played from portable speakers until late. What had once been a peaceful corner of nature was now alive with sound and color. Encouraged even bigger gatherings, she organized a lake luau, complete with flower garlands, steel drum music, and catered food. Residents arrived in tropical shirts, carrying coolers and cameras. The lake shimmered with lanterns floating on the surface, and laughter echoed across the water. The event drew so much attention that nearby neighborhoods began asking if they could join. Some residents invited relatives, who in turn brought friends. Before long, the lake was no longer just for the community. It was attracting people from all around. For many, this was thrilling. The lake became a point of pride, a feature that set their neighborhood apart. Homeowners boasted about the events, and social media filled with pictures tagged at Lake Harrow Beach. But beneath the excitement, small cracks were beginning to show. Parking became a problem. Streets were crowded with vehicles from outsiders, driveways were blocked, and tempers began to rise. Trash, once non-existent, now littered the sand and floated in the water. Some residents grumbled about noise late into the night, while others worried about safety with so many strangers around. The intimate gatherings of neighbors had shifted into large, crowded parties. George Miller noticed these changes more than most. He stood by his window on Friday evenings, watching streams of cars pull in, headlights flashing across his lawn. He walked past the lake on Saturday mornings, shaking his head at the piles of bottles, wrappers, and abandoned toys left behind. He spoke quietly to neighbors, asking if they thought it had gone too far. Some admitted they were uneasy, but most shrugged. "It's fun," they said. "Why ruin it?" Dismissed complaints with a smile. "Every community has growing pains," she assured residents at meetings. "But look at the joy it's bringing. We've built something special." Her charisma was powerful, and for many, it was easier to believe her than to raise conflict. Meanwhile, the HOA continued adding features. A floating dock appeared one morning, tied securely to the shoreline, perfect for diving and lounging. Paddle boats were rented out during events. The lake looked less like a residential property and more like a public resort. Not everyone felt comfortable with the direction things were heading, but momentum was hard to stop. The beach had become the heartbeat of the neighborhood, and anyone who questioned it risked sounding like a spoilsport. Even those who privately missed the quiet evenings by the water found themselves swept up in the festive energy. Still, George couldn't ignore the growing list of problems. He wondered how was funding the improvements. He noticed how budget reports at meetings seemed vague, with expenses lumped together under broad categories like community engagement. He also noticed that the same contractor kept getting hired for projects, a name suspiciously close to one of his relatives. But for now, few cared. The lake was too lively, too bright, too full of music and laughter for concerns to gain much traction. For most, this was the golden era of the neighborhood, a time when their ordinary community felt extraordinary. And through it all, Daniel Harrow remained unaware, still fighting silently in his hospital bed. The dock he once built for quiet fishing trips was now crowded with swimmers and teenagers. The bench where he had read on summer evenings was hidden beneath a volleyball net. His sanctuary had become a stage, and the show was only growing louder. By the end of summer, the neighborhood had changed in ways few would have imagined. The lake was no longer a quiet retreat tucked behind a single home. It was the pulse of the community. Children ran barefoot through the sand every evening, groups gathered around bonfires, and weekends brought streams of cars from outside the neighborhood. At first glance, it looked like success. But underneath the glow of ticky torches and laughter, a restlessness began to stir. George Miller noticed it most. He had lived in the community long before the parties, long before the ticky lights and floating docks. He remembered when the loudest sound by the lake was the call of a heron in the morning mist. Now when he walked the shoreline, he found wrappers, empty cups, and broken toys half buried in the sand. He tried to convince himself that the joy the lake brought to families was worth the disruption. Still, unease gnawed at him. One evening, while helping clean up after another event, George struck up a conversation with a younger neighbor named. She glanced around at the mess and sighed. "It's fun, sure," she admitted, "but I'm starting to wonder how much all this costs. Do you know where the money's coming from?" George shook his head. "That's exactly what I've been thinking." That small exchange planted a seed. George began attending HOA meetings with sharper ears, asking quiet questions and taking notes. He paid attention to budget reports which seemed increasingly vague. Large expenses were listed under broad categories: community engagement, improvement projects, beautification. No detailed breakdowns, no itemized lists. The more he looked, the more patterns he noticed. The same contractor kept appearing in discussions, the one hired to bring in the sand, to build the floating dock, to install the lights. The name meant little to most residents, but George recognized it. It was the business of his cousin. George didn't leap to conclusions. He knew that sometimes family connections happened naturally. But the more he investigated, the more suspicious it felt. Why were contracts never opened to bids? Why did invoices pass so quickly without question? He began quietly gathering copies of minutes, newsletters, and anything else that might help piece the puzzle together. While George searched for answers, the community itself started showing signs of strain. Families that had once enjoyed the novelty of the beach began grumbling about noise. Late-night music disrupted sleep. Cars from outsiders clogged the streets. Some residents who lived closest to the lake grew frustrated at finding trash in their yards each morning. At one board meeting, a woman named stood to speak. "I love the lake as much as anyone," she said carefully, "but we've lost control. This was supposed to be for us, but it feels like it belongs to everyone else now. I can't even park in front of my own house some weekends." Her words drew murmurs of agreement from a few, but was quick to respond. With her usual poise, she reassured the crowd. "Every growing project has challenges. These are signs of success, not failure. We are building something extraordinary together." Her confidence smoothed over doubts, at least for the moment. Yet the more brushed aside concerns, the more they grew in whispers and quiet conversations. Neighbors began choosing sides, those who loved the energy of the lake and those who longed for peace and order. Barbecues that once brought everyone together now had undercurrents of tension. George, meanwhile, was uncovering more. He noticed that the HOA newsletter featured glowing articles about the lake, each signed by herself. He noticed how often she referred to the project as her vision and how reluctant she seemed to allow others to lead. The beach was no longer simply a community feature. It was stage, and she stood at the center of it. One evening, George invited a few trusted neighbors to his porch. Came, along with a couple of others. He spread out the papers he had collected, budget notes, meeting minutes, contractor names. "I think there's more going on here than just parties," he said. "This doesn't look right." The group studied the papers, exchanging uneasy glances, leaned back in her chair. "If this is true, then she's been using our money for her own gain." "Not just money," George added. "She's using Daniel's property, and he never agreed to any of this." The porch fell silent for a moment. The reality was setting in. What had started as fun and laughter now carried the shadow of something else, something dishonest, perhaps even dangerous for the unity of the neighborhood. And while the group of neighbors considered their next move, the lake glowed in the distance, alive with another party. Music thumped, torches burned, and laughter rang out across the water. But for the first time, the joy felt fragile, as if one strong wave of truth could wash it all away. For months, the lake had been alive with music, bonfires, and celebration. The community called it progress, a triumph of togetherness, and for many it had become inseparable from daily life. But far away in a quiet hospital room, the man who owned that lake slept on, unaware of the transformation. Then one morning, Daniel Harrow's eyes flickered open. At first, he did not understand where he was. The ceiling was white, the air cool, and a steady beeping echoed beside him. His body felt heavy, as if anchored to the bed. Slowly, memories returned, the flash of headlights, the screech of tires, the sudden silence. He realized he had been in an accident, and he realized he had survived. Nurses entered quickly, their faces filled with surprise and relief. Doctors soon followed, explaining how remarkable his recovery was. He had been unconscious for months, they said, but his strength had carried him through. Daniel listened, dazed but grateful, though his thoughts soon drifted homeward. He longed for the lake, the quiet evenings on the dock, the comfort of the water that had always felt like a reflection of himself. It wasn't until days later, while speaking with a cheerful nurse, that he first heard the words that would change everything. "You'll be happy to see your lake again," she said with a smile. "I've heard the parties there are amazing. The beach is supposed to be beautiful." Daniel blinked. "The beach." The nurse laughed softly. "Oh yes, your community really did something special. They even put up gazebos and lights. People say it's the best spot in the area now." Confusion knotted in Daniel's chest. Beach, gazebo, parties. He tried to imagine what she meant, but the image clashed with his memories of a quiet, untouched shoreline. He felt a wave of unease, but exhaustion kept him silent. When he was finally strong enough to leave the hospital, his first request was simple. He wanted to go home. A neighbor offered to drive him. As they pulled into the community, Daniel noticed the changes immediately. Streets were more crowded than he remembered, lined with cars he did not recognize. He saw groups of people walking with towels and coolers, as if heading to a festival. Music drifted faintly through the trees. And then, as they turned the corner, the sight struck him like a blow. His lake was unrecognizable. The reeds and tall grasses were gone, replaced by a wide stretch of imported sand. Children built along the shore. A floating dock bobbed on the water, crowded with teenagers diving into the lake. Strings of lights twinkled from the gazebo, which was surrounded by picnic tables and tiki torches. Dozens of people milled about, laughing, eating, dancing. It was not his sanctuary. It was a beach resort. Daniel stepped out of the car, stunned. The dock he had built with his own hands was buried beneath volleyball nets. The bench where he had once sat with a fishing pole was nowhere in sight. The water rippled with the splashes of strangers who shouted and played without knowing or caring who owned the lake beneath them. He felt a surge of anger, sharper than anything he had ever known. How could this have happened? How could his private refuge have become a public playground? Determined for answers, Daniel made his way to the next homeowners association meeting. Word of his return spread quickly, and by the time he entered the hall, nearly every seat was filled. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some were shocked, some relieved, and others uneasy. At the front of the room sat Blaine, poised as always. Her smile faltered only slightly when she saw him step through the door. "Daniel," she said, rising with open arms as if greeting an old friend. "What a blessing to see you on your feet again." Daniel's voice was steady, though it carried the weight of months of silence. "What have you done to my lake?" The room went still. Ever composed, began to explain. She spoke of community, of joy, of how the lake had brought people together. She painted it as a triumph, something Daniel should be proud of. But as her words flowed, Daniel's expression hardened. He listened, but he did not agree. When she finished, he stepped forward. "That lake is mine," he said firmly. "It was written in my deed. It was never yours to take." Gasps rippled through the audience. For the first time, the community faced the clash between the man who owned the lake and the leader who had claimed it for everyone. The tension that had been building for months had finally found its breaking point. And as the meeting descended into murmurs and debates, Daniel realized this was only the beginning. Reclaiming his sanctuary would not be simple, was powerful, and the community was divided. But he was awake now, and he would not remain silent. The night of Daniel's return to the homeowners association, meeting became the talk of the neighborhood. Some residents had left unsettled by his words, while others whispered that he was being selfish after everything the community had built together. For the first time since the beach's creation, the neighborhood was truly divided. In the days that followed, Daniel wasted no time. He dug through the files stored in his home office, pulling out his property deed, maps, and paperwork that clearly stated the lake and its shoreline belonged solely to him. The ink was faded, but the words were unmistakable. The lake was private property, his property. George Miller was the first to visit him. Carrying a folder thick with copies of HOA minutes and budget notes, he knocked on Daniel's door. "I've been waiting for this moment," George said as Daniel welcomed him inside. "I knew something wasn't right. I started keeping records months ago. You'll want to see these." Together, they spread the papers across Daniel's dining table. There were receipts with vague descriptions, budget allocations hidden under broad categories, and contractor payments made without board approval. George pointed to one signature after another. "Look here. This is all tied back to. She's been funneling projects through her cousin's company. The lake isn't just a community project. It's her way of gaining power and recognition. And maybe profit, too." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had always avoided HOA politics, preferring the calm of his lake over meetings and arguments. But now the lake itself had become the... "We have to stop her," he said firmly. The next HOA meeting drew the largest crowd yet. Word spread quickly that Daniel would present his case. The hall was packed, with residents sitting shoulder to shoulder, some standing in the back. On one side sat those who supported Daniel, frustrated with noise, crowds, and the feeling of losing control. On the other side were loyal supporters who believed the lake had brought life and value to the neighborhood. When the meeting opened, greeted the crowd with her usual poise. "We've built something beautiful," she began, her voice warm and persuasive. "Lake Harrow is more than water and sand, it's our heart, and I believe we should continue forward together." But Daniel stood, holding up the deed. "This lake is mine," he said, his voice strong. "It always has been. I have the documents to prove it. What you've done, what you've spent, it was never within your rights. You turned my sanctuary into a circus without my consent." Gasps and murmurs swept through the room. Daniel handed the papers to the board's secretary, who read the deed aloud. The clarity of the words left little doubt. Tried to recover, leaning forward in her chair. "Daniel, no one denies your deed, but you were gone. The community needed leadership, and I stepped in. Look around you, the lake has brought joy, connection, and pride. Would you take that away from your neighbors after everything they've built?" A young mother stood. "My kids love the beach. It's the best part of this neighborhood now. Please don't shut it down." But then, who lived closest to the lake, rose as well. "With all respect, it's become unbearable. My driveway is blocked every weekend. Strangers leave trash in my yard. This isn't what I signed up for when I bought my home." The room erupted into debate. Voices clashed, some pleading for the beach to remain, others demanding it be shut down. George stood and raised his own voice over the noise. "This isn't about kids playing or families gathering. This is about honesty. This board spent thousands without proper approval, funneled money through family connections, and ignored property rights. That's not community. That's corruption." The accusation landed hard. All eyes turned too. Her smile faltered, her hands tightening on the table. "That's an outrageous claim," she said sharply. "Every decision I made was for the good of the neighborhood." But the room no longer seemed certain. Whispers spread like wildfire. For the first time, cracks appeared confident. The board announced an emergency vote to investigate finances and review leadership. Some cheered, others groaned, but the tide had turned. The golden glow of tiki lights and beach parties suddenly seemed less bright under the weight of doubt and division. Daniel left the meeting knowing the fight was far from over. The lake would not return to peace overnight. But the truth was now in the open, and the community could no longer ignore it. The showdown had begun, and the outcome would decide not only the fate of the lake, but the future of the entire neighborhood. The investigation moved quickly. For weeks, whispers filled the neighborhood about missing funds, questionable contracts, and the widening rift between neighbors who once greeted each other with easy smiles. The Homeowners Association had always been a quiet background presence, but now it had become the stage for a battle everyone seemed to care about. Daniel, though still regaining his strength, threw himself into the fight. He met with attorneys, spoke with county officials, and shared copies of his deed with anyone who doubted his ownership. George stood faithfully at his side, organizing documents and coaching residents on how to speak up. "This isn't just about the lake," George reminded them. "It's about honesty. If we let this go, what will they take next?" At the next official meeting, the board announced their findings. The room was so crowded that people spilled out into the hallway. Tension hung in the air as the secretary unfolded a stack of papers. "The review uncovered irregularities," she began. "Several contracts were awarded without competitive bidding. Payments were made to businesses owned by relatives of board members, and funds earmarked for road repairs were redirected to lakefront projects without resident approval." Gasps rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to who sat stiffly, her hands folded tight in her lap. For the first time, her polished smile was gone. Daniel rose slowly, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This lake was never yours to take. You spent money that wasn't yours. You turned my property into something it was never meant to be. And in doing so, you divided the very community you claimed to serve." A murmur of agreement swept the room. People who had once cheered for bonfires and barbecues now looked uneasy, realizing the cost of their new paradise. The board president cleared his throat. A motion has been put forward to remove Blaine as chair of the Homeowners Association, effective immediately. The vote was swift. Hands rose across the room, first cautiously, then in waves. When the count was finished, the result was undeniable, had been ousted. She stood, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You'll regret this," she said sharply. "Everything I did was for you. I gave this neighborhood life." But the words fell flat. She gathered her papers and left the room without another glance. The days that followed were not easy. Daniel quickly filed notices to reclaim control of the lake, posting clear signs that it was private property once again. The gazebos and volleyball nets were dismantled, and the sand was hauled away in truckloads. The once bustling beach fell silent. Some residents grumbled, upset at losing their gathering place. Others, relieved, welcomed the return of peace. For Daniel, the first evening alone by the water was bittersweet. He sat on the rebuilt dock, the rippling lake reflecting the setting sun. It was quiet again, no shouting, no music, no lights. Just the steady lap of water against the shore. His sanctuary had been restored, but not without scars. He knew trust among neighbors would take time to mend. George joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Well," he said, settling into the chair beside him, "you've certainly made history around here." Daniel chuckled softly. "Not the kind of history I wanted." He took a sip of the warm drink. "But at least the lake is what it's supposed to be." In the weeks ahead, the neighborhood began to heal. Without its dominating presence, meetings grew calmer, more balanced. Residents learned to speak with one another instead of shouting. Small gatherings still happened at the park, but they were quieter, more respectful. And though some missed the excitement of the beach, most admitted they preferred peace over chaos. For Daniel, the greatest victory was not just winning back the lake, but reclaiming his voice. He had spent years avoiding the politics of the community, retreating into his private world. But the ordeal taught him that silence could be costly. From then on, he attended meetings regularly, offering steady input, not as a ruler, but as a neighbor who cared. On one particularly calm evening, as the stars spread across the sky, Daniel leaned back on his dock and listened to the gentle sounds of the water. The lake was once again a mirror of his life, still, reflective, and honest. He had fought for it, and in the process, he had reminded the community of something simple yet powerful. Property, respect, and honesty must never be taken for granted. The gazebos were gone, the tiki torches were extinguished, the parties had faded into memory, but the lake remained, faithful, quiet, eternal. And Daniel Harrow, no longer a man lost in silence, finally felt at peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.